Live stream. Come on, live stream. There we go. Okay. So before we get started, those of you here physically in my one-on-one class that haven't had the chance to take the first test, you're going to need to get with me as soon as you can because we're getting close to test 2 and I can't really be doing both tests at the same time. So like come to me after class or email me and let me know when is a good time for you to retake this test. We've got a testing center that's open pretty much, well, throughout normal class times throughout the week. So if you have like a spare period, anytime Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday, just let me know and I can get you in there. For my LC4 class, LC3, you're good. I apparently accidentally put up like a prototype test on Wednesday, like 2 weeks ago, whatever it was that test was. And some of you did that and didn't get my email when I told you, hey, I had to fix it. And I gave you guys like all weekend to do the test. And a lot of you missed all the emails that I sent out. So please get back to me because I'm going to have to try to let some of you redo that this weekend. And this is your last call, so get back to me. That's all I can do there. That's the thing about online classes is I can't sit here and yell at you in the face. Because you're not physically coming to class. If you don't listen to the video or check emails, then what can I do? I think that's it. Oh yeah, papers are due next week, next Wednesday. If you physically come to class, I'd like you to physically bring your paper in, if you can. If you're not able to get it printed out, either at home or here in the library, that's fine. You can email it to me. Just send it to my Francis Marion email. That goes for all you online folks too. Just email it to me. Please try to send it all to one place. I don't want my personal email also flooded with it. just keep it all on my fmarion.edu email. That's going to be a nightmare. I think that's it. Any questions from anybody? Okay, cool. We should be getting near the end of this chapter today. If we don't finish it entirely, we'll be close enough to the end that I'll put this chapter up on Blackboard. And then chapter 6, and then after chapter 6 will be our next test. So we're getting there. Okay. So, when the last time with benign neglect and George Granville, benign neglect ending with George Granville, and the various acts that came about with George Granville, the Navigation Act, Sugar Act, etc., that, as I mentioned, were things that had existed throughout the empire that had just kind of been neglected in North America up until this point. So these committees of correspondence complaining about it, there was these acts that were suddenly being put on the American colonies, but also like everyone else in the empire was dealing with it. So it wasn't like anything special. Anyway, there's George Granville and mercantilism. Everybody being very angry about George Granville. and the not so impressed response of the English, like, oh yeah, they're so scary coming together, and yeah, well, that was the point. Is, oh, the colonists are meeting and talking about the various acts that we're putting together. Whoop-de-doo, we're so scared. They're a bunch of backwoods losers. So these acts to provide revenue for Britain continued. The Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed basically anything that involved paper, newspapers, contracts, playing cards, diplomas. This one caused quite a few issues because contracts include like marriage licenses, death certificates. If you get like a new house, you have to get, a housing contract, and that's another tax. Basically, well, let me take a step back. It didn't affect everybody per se. It mostly affected the upper class, because they're the ones that are really pushing oh, we can't be having this because taxes. So it's making them very angry. Now, unlike the previous acts, the Stamp Act was specifically written to raise money to pay the soldiers that were being stationed in the colonies to protect them against native attacks and, the French and Spanish who were still out there on the frontier. So this was money specifically being raised to pay the troops to protect the colonies. This was military tax. So Virginia House of Burgesses, who we've talked about many times, the Virginia, I guess Parliament will be the correct term at this point in time. Not quite Congress yet. Patrick Henry was in charge at the time. Obviously, they opposed the Stamp Act. The Sons of Liberty was led by Samuel Adams. The Sons of Liberty were very violent. They were, to the British, they were essentially domestic terrorists. And yeah, they burned stuff down. They attacked people. They would run royal officials out of town. It got so bad that once the Stamp Act was officially in effect, because it was like, hey, here's the Stamp Act. It goes into effect in like 6 months, just letting you guys know. And the response was, let me see here actually. Yeah, actually the Stamp Act was announced a year before its passage. Bless you. Sons of Liberty, yada, yada, yada. Hung an effigy of stamp distributor Andrew Oliver from a tree. Mock funeral procession, joined by farmers, artisan, yada, yada, yada. Carried the fake corpse of the Boston Stamp Office to the Boston Stamp Office and destroyed the building. They saved pieces of lumber, stamped them, set them on fire outside of Oliver's house. Oliver, the official who would have been doing the Stamp Act, had already left town. His brother-in-law, who was the lieutenant governor, arrived at the scene and tried to quiet the crowd, which only angered them further. Destroyed Oliver's stable house, coach, and carriage. 12 days later, demonstrators attacked the homes of Judge William Story, Customs Officer Benjamin Hallowell, and Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson. So yeah, Sons of Liberty just tore stuff up. Now the actual Stamp Act Congress, the folks who came together to make more official protests about it as opposed to just like burning things down. Tended to be more affluent. You know, they were businessmen and plantation owners and those who were more directly affected by the Stamp Act, because again, you know, it was affecting the people with money. The regular farmers didn't really have a stake in it, but they were being told that they did because they were more numerous. So they wanted to repeal the act because this was, and there was taxation without representation, which they saw as tyranny, because technically the colonies didn't have members of parliament elected from their number. Now this did push a rise in American identity, because now it was this idea of, well, we're not being treated as equal British citizens because we don't have representation within Parliament. Now they did repeal the Stamp Act in March of 1766, which proved that if the colonies got rowdy enough, I can't talk, they could get what they wanted, but they also were not pushing for independence. This wasn't, again, like you'd see in your really basic American history where it's like Stamp Act and then July 4th and we're pushing for independence. I mean, this is 10 years before that. I still can't talk. This is 10 years before all that, and they were just trying to get back to where things had been, where the American colonies had some degree of autonomy from Britain, but not like full-blown independence, because Britain's the largest empire in the world and has the largest economy in the world, and you kind of want to be a part of that. Also, some real dramatic stuff here. An emblem of the effects of the stamp. Oh, the fatal stamp. Yeah, the stamp's going to kill us all. Here's the Sons of Liberty hanging out with the tax collector. Not a tax collector, one of the stamp guys. They've already tarred and feathered him. That's why he's covered in feathers. And they're pouring like boiling water in his mouth. And you see there in the background the Liberty Tree with the noose hanging from it. Now this is obviously a much later image, because you can see the Boston Tea Party happening there in the background, which comes later. Here's the very exciting Stamp Act Congress. You can tell everyone's, the one dude in the back's like, oh, everybody calm down, and the guys in the front looking really bored. It's great. So let's get to something a little more eventful. So Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which basically said that they could pass any law to bind the colonies and peoples of North America closer to Britain. So they passed a law that said they could pass whatever laws they wanted, which, I don't know, I feel like that's kind of the point of Parliament. June of 1767, we had Charles Townshend. So he was the new prime minister. Again, prime minister is the basically chief executive officer of the British government, because the king doesn't really have the power anymore. The prime minister is in charge of Parliament. So that's their version of the president, if you want to use the American analogy. So the Townshend Act was another series of taxes, glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Of course, the colonists freaked out because that's apparently what we're good at. They protested and boycotted these items. Once again, Samuel Adams was right in the middle of it. So Britain responded by sending 2 regiments of the British Army to enforce the laws, which, I don't know, a little bit of an overkill. Which I don't know. I guess maybe depending on how much of the colonies were protesting and boycotting. I guess 2 regiments would be spread rather thin. If it was just Boston, that's a lot. And it also mentions that women in particular were very important in maintaining the boycott because they were the ones who usually were out there, making the purchases for the family, and therefore needed to be aware of what was British products or what was being boycotted at the time. And a lot of times they would even, rather than buy stuff in town, they would go home and make what they needed. So eventually this led to the Boston Massacre. Now, it's a whole thing. There were British troops stationed in Boston. Some boys were throwing snowballs and insults at a soldier who was guarding the Boston Custom House, which eventually led to a larger group surrounding the guard, who then called for help. They attempted to disperse the crowd. No one knows who shot first, but in the end, shots were fired into the crowd. Let's see, 11 men were hit, 4 were killed on the spot, including the ex-slave Crispus Attucks. This was called the Boston Massacre by the Sons of Liberty because they used this as anti-British propaganda. They even turned the funeral for the 4 men into a parade around the city to continue raising anti-British fervor. They murdered our boys. And of course, the Committees of Correspondence, which had been previously, spreading the discontent about the Stamp Act and whatnot, formed again to spread the news about the Boston Massacre and, less the news, more the propaganda. So in response, the British repealed most of the Townshend duties, except for the tax on tea, because, the American colonists are still essentially British citizens, so they're going to want their tea. Yeah.
I can't do that. Yeah,
Probably for the best.
if I'm gonna talk about it,
You gotta throw it out, yeah. Um, so there's an engraving of the Boston Massacre. This is actually by Paul Revere, as you can see down there at the bottom right. Paul Revere, we'll talk about in a little bit. I'll see how many of you know what his actual job was, rather than riding around and yelling at people in the middle of the night. Now, granted, this was, again, an engraving, so a lot of the colors kind of ran. That's why the dog is kind of a splotch down here. But yeah, this isn't just like a like pen on paper kind of thing. It's an actual engraving. I don't know if it's woodblock or like on a piece of pottery. I'm not sure. It's the whole thing. Okay. So there was all of this general discontent, this rallying against the British in these seaport towns, but as we've seen in previous chapters, the seaport towns were not the majority of the population. And the resistance against local authorities continued to be rather common. We mentioned last time four? Gracious. Be done blow my brains out of 5 times. Don't have any up here, sorry. So we talked about the regulators in North Carolina last time. So Governor Tryon said that Parliament was abusing its power with the taxes that they were instituting on the colonies, the various taxes on tea and glass and paper and whatnot. However, at the same time, he said that the regulators were traitors because they were questioning his own use of speculators and politicians and various employers to squeeze every last penny out of his people for taxes to build his fancy manor house. So, politicians. So, just a year after the Boston Massacre, he sent troops to quell the regulators, killing 20, injuring 100, and then hanging 6 of their leaders. So, not worth talking about because it wasn't the British killing American citizens, it was Americans killing Americans. And it was substantially more than 4 dudes getting shot in the street because they were harassing armed guards. But yeah. South Carolina also had a branch of regulators. So they came about in 1676. Oh, I did that last time too. 1767, they actually took control of western portions of the colony because despite the colonial government demanding taxes and whatnot from the people living there, they weren't providing any kind of civil services, which is to say militia protection from the natives, or mail services, or any kind of building aid. So the regulators just were like, hey, we're going to do this ourselves. So they just took the western portions of the colony and did it themselves. So within 2 years, the South Carolina Assembly were just like, hey, we don't have the power to do what Governor Tryon did. They negotiated a settlement with regulators and extended red representation to the frontier regions so that they could have their voices heard and actually have that tax money put to use to improve conditions in the region. So things went better here in South Carolina, which is weird to say. Usually things are worse here in South Carolina. So yeah, our regulators didn't get murdered. So here we have the North Carolina regulators capturing a powder escort. And I think this is them getting shot up by the North Carolina militia. Okay. Now, this next slide is what I like to call the most British slide I have for this class. I probably have a more British slide from actual like European history class, but when the slide starts with T, it's a very British slide. So the British East India Company was given a monopoly over tea distribution in the colonies after May of 1773. The British East India Company was not a good company. They had been in charge of India for like 100 years, and it resulted in like a massive rebellion that got tens of thousands of people killed. So the fact that they're just being given monopoly over tea distribution here in the colonies, nobody was real chill about. So most responses to this were simple protests. People wouldn't buy the tea, and a lot of the store owners who were supplied the tea by the British East India Company just wouldn't even sell it. They just like would leave it in the back. It's like, we're not even putting this on the shelf. Screw it. So this, of course, led to the infamous Boston Tea Party. 50 men disguised as natives for some reason and tossed 45 tons of tea into the Boston Harbor. Every time I read that, I have to remind myself, oh yeah, that's always a lot more tea than I remember learning about. 45 tons is a great deal of tea. Britain responded poorly. So they passed the Coercive Acts in 1774. The port of Boston was basically blockaded until residents paid for the destroyed tea. They'd moved the Massachusetts court back to England, which, if you recall from like chapter 2 or 3, that was something that had been in Massachusetts from the start. Like when the Puritans landed in Massachusetts, or in Boston even, they put the court there in Boston. Revoked the charter of the colony, which meant they were no longer like their own colony. They were just under Britain's rule. And also created a new quartering act, which put soldiers in colonist homes. So basically they occupied Boston. Boston was like a conquered city. because they destroyed 45 tons of tea. You don't mess with British tea, man. So the colonists call these the Intolerable Acts because, I mean, to be fair, that's a lot of stuff. I usually joke about the colonists being dramatic, which they were, but yeah, that's a lot of stuff. And a lot of them did begin arming themselves because, like, hey, the British basically have occupied Boston. We need to be ready to fight. And again, to be fair to the colonists, which I'm going to give the colonists a lot of crap because that's just how I am. But like fighting your colonial overlords was not uncommon. Look at Ireland, which had an uprising like every 30 years. So the idea of, Britain's being heavy-handed, we're probably going to have to fight them a little bit. That wasn't unusual. That wasn't like, we're about to have a war of independence and we're going to make our own country. At the time, they're just like, we're probably going to have a little bit of a dust-up. We're going to shoot each other some, and then we'll figure stuff out. Like, they were ready to shoot each other some. So this quickly led to the Continental Congress, where representatives from the various colonies met in September in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Actually, like immediately after Boston was basically blockaded, there were a group of patriots in Williamsburg, Virginia, in the spring of 1774 that said that all the colonies had to send representatives to the Continental Congress in September of that year. So, this happened in December, coercive acts in like January of the next year, because right after, and they're like, hey, we need to get together and figure something out.
Well, I'm from there, but like going downtown, it's like,
Philly, I've got a picture of where the Continental Congress took place.
and I look so old.
Yeah, it's very neat. It's very pretty red
really
brickwork.
pretty.
And again, like this idea of breaking free from Britain wasn't really in people's minds because this was Britain at the time. Like, it wasn't just this island off the coast of Europe, it was most of the world. I mean, and even just up here in North America, it was like all of Canada. So, yeah. I'm not sure, actually. I don't know what part they had in South America at the time.
How they got that piece over there, and then there's two little white spots? They don't have that stuff? They got everything around it?
What? In Canada?
No, it's Africa.
Oh, there was a lot. There was a lot going on in Africa. There was a lot of back and forth between the British and the Germans and the Italians, and they were like taking pieces, and the Dutch were down there too. Yeah, there was a lot of weird things happening in Africa at the time. So here's the boys doing their thing. Some of them didn't get the memo to dress up. Oops, bumped the mic. I'm sure that sounded good. Real good there, dude. White, blue shirt and khaki pants. I mean, at least a barefoot, guys. Come on. And I mean, at least they're trying. Ubisoft. Yeah, India tea, real good. Thanks. That really looks like 45 tons. Anyway. Some lovely propaganda artwork coming up here. The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Draught. The various acts and bills and whatnot being forced on Boston. Bostonians in distress up there in this cage surrounded by cannons, because again, they were basically blockaded. And there was like basically a smuggling campaign from the other colonies to bring in food and supplies. It's weird seeing these dudes in powdered wigs like eating raw fish. Very strange. All right. Now let's get to the Continental Congress. So we had 56 delegates who met in Philadelphia's Carpenter Hall, representing every colony but Georgia, because nobody wanted to talk to Georgia, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if Georgia. The book doesn't mention if Georgia decided not to show up, or if it was because they were mostly like a debtor colony, so they didn't feel like they needed to be involved. I'm not sure. Are you good?
I don't know which one. I went to Granville. They're going to National School like 8 times. I might be done.
You might be dying. I hope you don't have. I mean, I don't know what you'd be allergic to in here. So most of these delegates already knew each other. They had been working together in the Stamp Act Congress and other petitions. But they weren't necessarily all of the same mind. We had radicals like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Christopher Gadsden, who were very ready to pick up guns and go shoot some British. There were moderates like George Washington and John Dickinson from Pennsylvania, who were trying to take a, more moderate approach. And then conservatives like John Jay from New York, who felt like we need to talk it out with the British and avoid confrontation, avoid making things worse than they already were. Now, despite all this, there wasn't any talk of independence. I mean, even radicals like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry weren't like, yeah, we need to make our own country. This was still too early for that sort of thought, because again, Britain was the biggest empire in the world and had the largest economy in the world, and we weren't really too keen on breaking away from that. We just wanted to get back to the way things were, where we could kind of do our own thing. Britain would back off, but we were still like under the umbrella of the British Empire. So the resistance to the coercive acts were now in the hands of the elites, the people who, again, were incentivized economically to get things back to the way they were now the ones actually in charge of this resistance. It wasn't this grassroots farmers trying to take on the big scary British Empire. It was businessmen and plantation owners and merchants and all of that. But it did also make things less about individual colonies. It wasn't so much about Boston itself being basically blockaded, so much as it was a group effort for all the colonies, except Georgia, apparently. We'll get back to Georgia. Georgia shows up later. Yeah, there's Carpenter Hall. Very pretty, very, very lovely brickwork. I like nice red brick buildings.
I don't know how they even had to build like that. No problem.
It wasn't that long ago.
Still got some good stuff.
I'm sure they've kept it very well furnished in the last couple hundred years. I mean, the inside, I'd hate to have to. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's far more than anything we have here. Philly. Yeah, I mean, when I was in Ireland, I didn't realize until about 2 months in that the campus that I was on was right next to like the ruins of a castle from the 1200s.
Oh, wow.
It's like, oh, okay. 800-year-old castle just hanging out over here.
Oh, that's so cool. People used to live in that.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
and they were just like around. Now this is a quote from William Jennings Bryan in 1908, so it's much later than the actual Continental Congress. Conceived in freedom, purchased with blood, can be preserved only by constant vigilance, yada, yada, yada. I don't know what William Jennings Bryan was up to in 1908. That's it for chapter 5, actually. So we did get that done. Good. I'll put it up on Blackboard. So yeah, the colonies reacted pretty strongly to pressure from the Parliament. And while at first it was individual, oh no, I'm going to sneeze. Don't want to sneeze in the microphone. That won't be great.
I think it's
It slowly became more organized because they were able to use what communication they had. So these squabbles turned into colony-wide resistance. But again, it should be mentioned that this wasn't some immediate, like, monolithic, all the colonists against all the British movement. It will never be that way, even when the war begins. There was still plenty of resistance against colonial powers on the frontier, for example. And even as late as 1774, which is like, oh, that's right before the war happened. Surely everybody was gearing up for it. Nobody really within the colonies was pushing for independence. They just wanted to return back to the way things were. I mean, usually between when Britain and France were getting ready to do something, 2 years before the war is officially declared, they're already fighting each other. They're already, like, trying to take forts from each other, and it's like 2 years later, oh yeah, we should declare war. So yeah, that's chapter 5. Let's get a couple of slides into chapter 6 before we finish today, since we've got like 20 minutes. Where's my thing? Here we go. That's the wrong class. Let's see, we want to talk about Rome. Okay. So we have chapter 6, revolutions, as it's called in the book, because, again, it wasn't one single defining event. 1775 to 1783 was a relatively long war. So, 18th of April, 1775, British troops began moving towards Lexington and Concord because they had gotten reports that the colonists had been stockpiling arms and ammunition in these little villages, towns, not especially large places. However, the fact that they were moving towards Lexington and Concord was discovered by Paul Revere and several other writers. It wasn't just Paul Revere, but he's the one that's most famous. So he rode ahead of these marching soldiers and warned the militia in Lexington, and I don't remember if he was able to go on to Concord or someone else went on ahead of him. But the boys in Lexington were forewarned. So the local militia in this region were known as the Minutemen for the speed at which they were supposedly able to get ready, which I don't know. It seems like it takes like a minute to load one of these muskets, so I guess they just fall in their pajamas. So the first shots of the Revolution happened in Lexington, but the British were far better equipped and far better trained and were able to push the colonists back. But by the time they got to Concord, the cache of arms and ammunition had been moved, so their mission to disarm the colonists before they were able to even do anything had completely failed. So they began making their way back to Boston, and the colonists followed them and started harassing them on the way back, which is to say shooting from the trees and setting up ambushes. And the British took something like 200 casualties on the way back, which was substantially more than they took at all in the actual fighting at Lexington and Concord. Yeah, killing 73 and wounding 200. Hid behind trees, walls, and barns, and battered the British soldiers as they marched back to Boston. Outraged, Bostonians attacked British troops and forced them to retreat to ships in the harbor, but the British eventually did take Boston back because, you know, it's the British Army. While this was going on, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys began their push to take Fort Ticonderoga. So this went from the militia intercepting a group of British marching through the countryside to an actual assault on a military stronghold. We'll get back to the Green Mountain Boys a little bit later. So in May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress was meeting and needed to discuss what the hell was going on. Because, hey, things have dramatically escalated. This was no longer just the British are blockading Boston, but they're actually shooting at us now. We need to negotiate with the British and get this figured out before things spiral. This was the first actual push for independence. Others were like, hey, we need to actually break away from Britain because they are shooting citizens. Now, to be fair, it's not like they were shooting unarmed citizens. They were met in the field with muskets, so, to be fair. June 16th, Battle of Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. We only talk about Bunker Hill for some reason, but Breed's Hill is just as important. So General Sir William Howe, the British commander, led the battle against the colonial forces who, let's see, yeah, there was a Patriot fortification on Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. Had just like dug in the night before, and the British realized, oh hey, this isn't a good place for us to have enemy forces. We need to roll in and take care of them. The British suffered 1,000 casualties. That's a lot of people, especially in this age of war when you didn't have a lot of dudes out on the field and you were shooting muskets, which is like one shot and then you take 5 minutes to reload. It also mentions the British won the day when the Patriots ran out of ammunition. The colonists ran out of bullets to shoot at
That's so unfortunate.
at the British. So imagine how many more British would have gotten killed if the Patriots had more bullets. The Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill were really good fortifications. I mean, even though it was, I'll show you guys a picture in a minute, just like a hill with, it looks almost like a World War I trench. But when all you've got is muskets, it's really good. So even though they technically lost the battle at Bunker Hill, it was a blow to the British, and it emboldened many within the colonies to push for independence. Because the British didn't just roll over the colonists, they got the crap kicked out of them and were only able to really eventually go up there and capture them because they ran out of bullets. So quick, I mentioned this last PowerPoint, brain's shutting off, last chapter. Paul Revere, his job was not to ride around and yell at people in the middle of the night. Does anybody happen to know what his actual day job was? Technically. He was like the second most important person in Boston. He was very rich. He wasn't a commander. He was a silversmith.
What is that? I would have guessed he's ugly.
He made things out of silver.
He looks like that. He looks like Will Ferrell. Just without actual hair. He looks like Will.
He made things out of silver. He also was like very important in the church in Boston. So he had a lot of like political connections. And then you got the Minutemen, which I had to do. Anyway, you got the Minutemen doing their drills. And here we got the boys at Bunker Hill. Again, you don't want to charge into that, as long as they've got bullets, I guess. But even like, once they run out, these guns are heavy, so they're very good clubs. I mean, that's not a joke. Like, once they run out of bullets, or if their line gets charged while they're reloading, you just grab it. You just grab the gun by the long bit and you hit them with the butt of the gun, because those are extremely heavy muskets. You can, I was going to say knock somebody out. You can kill someone by beating them over the head with a musket. They're very heavy. Okay, let's do one more slide. One or two more. We'll see. So, the fact that some dudes could go up on a hill and bring enough ammo to kill 1,000 British. Well, I don't know if they killed 1,000 British. Casualties just means people knocked out of the battle. So, injure or kill 1,000 British. Before they ran out of ammunition, did convince the Continental Congress that, hey, maybe we should actually have an army that would be useful in fighting a war. Let's see if you guys know better than my last class. And who would they put in charge of this army? Oh no, nobody's talking. Very good. Brigadier General George Washington will be put in charge of the Continental Army. Yes, that's the easy one. However, though, the Continental Congress wasn't like a national government. The colonies were all still like independent little state, not in the current usage, but like the original term of just like an independent governmental body. Each colony was its own independent state, essentially. So Washington had to go to each local militia to recruit and needed each colony to supply him basically voluntarily. Like he couldn't go in and draft people for the army. He had to go in, it's like, okay, who wants to join me in fighting the British? You know, the greatest army in the world. Don't worry about smallpox. It'll be fine. A lot of his work was getting his men to work together or to work at all. This is something I've said a lot about George Washington, and again, I'm going to be harsh about the colonists or the colonies because a lot of our history is very mystical about like the origins of our country, and it doesn't need to be because history is history. It doesn't need to be made like legendary. And George Washington wasn't a great general. He wasn't even a very good tactician. But what he was good at doing was keeping his men from just like up and leaving. And that's important if you want to be a leader in the military, is keeping your men from just like deserting. So I will definitely give Washington that. There's a lot of people in history who were terrible people. I'd say Washington was pretty good at what he was doing. He was no Napoleon though. You know, when he went into battle, he wasn't necessarily going to win. But he could keep his troops from just like leaving. So Washington's army needed to do two things here at the start of the war: to push the British out of Boston and to secure the colonies from attack from the north because, well, as we've seen from that earlier map, the British had Canada under their control. So in November 1775, General Richard Montgomery managed to capture Montreal. However, reinforcements that were meant to resupply him, which were being led by General Benedict Arnold, were decimated by cold and smallpox because smallpox is still just floating around. So they were unable to push the British out of Quebec. talk more about Benedict Arnold later. There was, however, an important victory in the winter of 1775 and 76. General Henry Knox delivered weapons that were captured at Fort Ticonderoga. Remember, Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys went up to Fort Ticonderoga not just to capture it because it was there, but because it was a military storehouse for the British. They got a hold of a bunch of cannons. General Knox showed up and delivered those cannons down to Washington. Washington took 43 cannons to the Dorchester Heights and just started shelling the hell out of the British and managed to drive them out of Boston. Here's Montgomery dying. Apparently he didn't do too good. All very dramatic.
Yeah, he died like a princess, right?
Right? It's all very dramatic. Here's Washington setting up on Dorchester Heights and just shelling the hell out of Boston. Apparently we had some pirates out in the bay, so when the British tried to retreat, they got shot at. The book doesn't mention much about that, so I don't think they gave the British too much trouble, because, again, the British has, like, the world's greatest navy. But apparently that's the thing. And that's actually something that we'll see again in Europe. Napoleon does the same thing to the British in Spain. It's very funny. I don't think the British like that very much. Okay. Unfortunately, we're not done with this section yet, but whatever. I'll see y'all next week, I guess. Y'all be safe. Talk to y'all a bit more in a minute. Okay. Yeah. LC4, you guys, I sent an email out to those of you that I didn't get a grade for. You should be seeing a 0. Those of you that I did grade already, you're not involved in this, so sorry. Those of you in LC3, you got the full test, and if you didn't take it, well, you're out of luck because we already did that. Okay, that's all I've got. I will get this up on Blackboard as soon as I can. Talk to y'all later. Bye.